On my 30th birthday, I sat alone in Denver, watching my phone go dark, hoping my mother would remember. At 11:52 at night, a text arrived. "Oh, is it today? Happy birthday." I did not reply. I shut off my phone and the lights, letting the silence speak. Exactly 1 week later, she called, not to apologize, but for a signature to save a multi-million-dollar project and the lie my family had hidden for years. "My name is Brinley Diaz. I am 30 years old," a fact that settled over me in the quiet isolation of my Denver apartment. "I work as a financial risk tracer at Silverline Integrity Group, a corporate investigative consultancy. My job is to find the things people desperately want to keep hidden. I spend my days tracking phantom assets, unraveling shell companies, and following the digital breadcrumbs of embezzlers who think they are smarter than the ledger. I look for anomalies. I am very good at finding them. But on the Tuesday of my 30th birthday, the only anomaly I was looking for was a missed call from my mother. The day dragged on in a humiliating state of suspended animation. It is a pathetic thing to be a grown woman, successfully tearing apart corporate fraud schemes by day, while secretly checking her phone under the desk, waiting for a mother's text. My colleagues at Silverline remembered. They brought a bakery cake with vanilla frosting into the break room at noon. My friends texted, called, and sent digital gift cards. The screen illuminated with well wishes from people who had known me for barely a fraction of my life. From Elena Diaz-Varden, my mother, there was nothing, not in the morning, when she usually had her coffee. Not in the afternoon, not during the evening commute. I spent the evening in my apartment, watching the city lights of Denver flicker to life against the glass. I ordered takeout I barely ate. I told myself she was just busy. She was always busy. My stepfather, Ross Varden, demanded a lot of oxygen in the room, and his 2 children from a previous marriage required constant maneuvering. I was the low-maintenance child. The one who did not need reminding. The one who was fine. I sat on my sofa in the dark. The clock ticked past 10 at night, then 11. The shame of hoping began to curdle into something heavier. I watched the minutes change on my digital wall clock. At 11:52 at night, 8 minutes before my birthday officially expired, my phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen glowed. "Oh, is it today? Happy birthday." It was a text from Elena, short, flimsy. It read like a panicked afterthought, a sticky note she found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Every year before this, I would have replied. I would have sent back a heart emoji, or a text saying, "Thank you, love you, no worries." I would have paved over her negligence to make her feel better about forgetting me. I had spent a lifetime making it easy for my family to overlook me. This time, my fingers hovered over the glass screen. The glow cast long shadows on my living room walls. I did not type a response. I did not offer absolution. I pressed the power button, set the device face down on the wood, and turned off the single lamp in the corner. I sat in the pitch black and let the silence wash over me. It hurt, a dull, aching throb in the center of my chest. But as the minutes ticked past midnight, the ache began to solidify. The feeling of being forgotten settled into the floorboards of my mind, hardening into a cold, sharp clarity. Exactly 1 week later, the phone rang. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The Denver sky was an overcast gray, matching the spreadsheet scrolling across my dual monitors at Silverline. I saw the caller ID. "Mom." I let it ring 3 times before picking up. "Brinley." "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice trilled through the receiver. It was unusually soft, coated in a layer of artificial warmth that immediately set off warning bells in my head. It was the tone she used when she was managing a crisis for Ross, not when she was talking to her daughter. "Hi, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "How are you? How is the weather in Colorado? Are you working too hard?" She fired off the questions in rapid succession, not waiting for the answers. It was a performance of maternal interest, completely devoid of substance. "I am fine, working." "Good, good. I am so glad." "Listen, honey," she pivoted. the fake warmth dipping into a casual, breezy register. I hate to bother you while you are at the office, but I just need a tiny favor. A little administrative thing. My hands paused over my keyboard. What kind of thing? Oh, it is nothing, really. Ross is just closing on the final refinancing round for the Juniper Ridge development. You know how these banks are. They need 1,000,000 signatures for the silliest things. It is just a technicality to clear the title on some old family trust stuff, so the lenders can push the money through. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. A signature for Ross's project? Yes, it takes 2 seconds. You do not lose anything, I promise. It is just a formality. You know how it is. Family, helping family with just one signature. If we do not get this back to the title company by the end of the day, Ross is going to have a heart attack over the delays. The narrative was too polished. The urgency was forced. My professional instincts, usually reserved for my clients at Silverline, flared to life. Send it to my personal email, I told her. I will look at it when I get home. Brinley, it really needs to be done today. Just use a digital signature. Send it to my email. Mom, I am in the middle of an audit. I hung up before she could protest further. An hour later, an email dropped into my inbox with a secure attachment. The subject line read, Routine Closing Documents. I did not wait until I got home. I opened it right there at my desk, minimizing my actual work. The document was 52 pages long. Elena had said it was a simple technicality, perhaps hoping I would do what most people do. Scroll to the final page, click the highlighted yellow box, and sign blindly. But I am not most people. I read contracts for a living. I started at page 1. The first 15 pages were standard refinancing boilerplate, outlining loan terms between a commercial lender and Ross Varden's primary holding company. But as I scrolled into the middle sections, the legal jargon began to shift. It moved away from corporate debt and into the realm of personal trusts and estate law. On page 28, my eyes locked onto a paragraph that made the breath catch in my throat. There, buried beneath a dense block of indemnification clauses, was a name, not Varden, not my mother's married name. Rosa Diaz Land Trust. Rosa Diaz was my maternal grandmother. She had passed away years ago. I stared at the screen. My grandmother's name was tied to a legal entity I had never heard of. I kept reading, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The document was asking me, as the undersigned, to explicitly consent to the pledging of assets held within the Rosa Diaz Land Trust as collateral for Ross Varden's commercial loan. I scrolled down further, my eyes scanning the fine print with surgical precision. On page 41, I found the waiver. It was a comprehensive release of liability. By signing this document, I would be agreeing to waive any and all rights to past financial claims, audits, or grievances against the current and former trustees of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust. I would be legally declaring that all prior management of the trust was acceptable and unquestionable. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The cold clarity I had felt on the night of my birthday returned, but this time it was sharp enough to draw blood. They had not forgotten my birthday at all. They had ignored it because turning 30 activated my right to examine the trust, and they were counting on the quiet daughter they had trained to expect nothing to sign before asking a single question. I looked at the document on my screen. I did not sign it. Instead, I clicked print, listening to the machine in the corner of the office hum to life, spitting out the pages of my family's lie, one by one. I grew up in a sun-bleached suburb of Tucson, Arizona, where the heat rising off the asphalt could blur the horizon line into a watery mirage. My biological father walked out the front door when I was barely 3 years old, leaving nothing behind but a few flannel shirts and a quiet void in the hallway. For the first chapter of my life, it was just me and Elena. We lived in a modest stucco house with a struggling lemon tree in the backyard. In those early years, she was a fiercely present mother. She was the kind of woman who memorized the lines to every single one of my elementary school plays. She knew without asking that I hated the texture of cooked carrots and that heavy thunderstorms made my chest tight. She could look at the precise way my shoulders slumped when I walked through the door and know exactly what kind of bad day I had experienced at school. We were a team. That warmth did not disappear in a sudden, violent explosion. It evaporated slowly, day by day, after she married Ross Varden. I was 9 years old when Ross moved us into his sprawling, multi-level home on the much wealthier side of the city. Ross was a man carved from sharp angles and restless ambition. He spoke in the language of leverage, asset acquisitions, and market shares, even while sitting at the dinner table. He came with 2 children from a bitter previous marriage. Callum, who was 12, and Noelle, who was 10. They were chaotic, loud, and constantly engulfed in some form of high-stakes adolescent drama. Almost overnight, the gravitational pull of our new household shifted. The entire family ecosystem began to revolve exclusively around the Varden children. Callum needed private lacrosse coaching, expensive standardized test prep courses, and endless parental intervention to keep his grades above water. Noelle required a constant stream of emotional validation, out-of-state cheerleading camps, and therapy sessions to cope with her parents' messy divorce. Their needs were incredibly loud. They took up all the oxygen in the house. Because I was quiet, because my grades were consistently excellent without any prodding, and because I did not throw tantrums when things went wrong. I was immediately categorized as the child who did not require maintenance. I was the easy one. I was the girl who was simply fine. There is a specific, insidious kind of trauma in being the easy child. No one laid a hand on me in that house. There were no drunken rages, no physical blows, no screaming matches where I was called worthless. The abuse of my childhood was entirely passive. It was the trauma of continuous, systemic omission. They just kept choosing other people, over and over again, until my absence from their priority list became the established law of the house. By the time I was in the 7th grade, I had mastered the art of ghosting my own childhood. I learned how to carefully forge my mother's flowing signature on school permission slips, because she was always too busy managing one of Callum's academic crises to look at my paperwork. I memorized the city bus schedule so I would never have to ask Ross for a ride to the public library. I learned how to cook dried pasta and frozen chicken breasts at 6 o'clock in the evening because dinner was now dictated by when Noelle finished her extracurricular activities, which was usually hours later. I did not cry about it. Instead, I built a rigid psychological defense mechanism. I told myself that I was simply more mature than my step-siblings. I convinced myself that independence was a virtue, not a symptom of being severely neglected. Whenever Elena failed me, I did the heavy emotional labor of making excuses for her. When she missed my regional debate championship during my sophomore year of high school, I told myself it was perfectly understandable, because Noelle had suffered a minor breakdown over a ruined formal dress that same afternoon. When my 16th birthday rolled around and I received a generic $50 gift card to a department store, just weeks after Callum was gifted a brand new sports utility vehicle for his 17th birthday, I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat and thanked them politely. I rationalized that Callum needed a safe car for his long commute to his private academy. While I only took the bus down the street, I became my mother's defense attorney in the courtroom of my own mind. The only person who refused to participate in this collective family delusion was my maternal grandmother, Rosa Diaz. Abuela Rosa lived in a small, immaculate house 20 miles away from the Varden estate. She was a woman of terrifying practicality. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words carried the weight of absolute truth. She had worked her entire life as a bookkeeper for a local agricultural firm, and she viewed the world through the uncompromising lens of a ledger, credits and debits, truths and lies. She saw exactly what was happening to me in that sprawling house. During the rare weekends I was allowed to take the bus to visit her, she would sit me down at her worn kitchen table, slide a plate of warm food toward me, and offer the kind of blunt advice Elena was too entirely absorbed in her new life to provide. Rosa did not offer empty platitudes or hugs. She offered survival tactics. She taught me how to balance a checkbook by the time I was 12 years old. She showed me how to read the fine print on a bank application. Most importantly, She instilled in me a fierce, bordering on paranoid, sense of self-protection regarding legal documents. I can still hear her voice, raspy from decades of unfiltered cigarettes, echoing in that small kitchen. She would tap her index finger hard against the wooden table. Do not ever sign your name to something you do not understand. Brinley, I do not care if it is a teacher, a boss, or the priest at the parish. And I especially do not care if it is family. People will use your trust as a weapon against you. You keep your own copies. You protect your own name. She knew Ross Varden was a shark who only valued things he could leverage. She knew her daughter, Elena, had traded her maternal backbone for the comfort of a wealthy zip code. Rosa knew that eventually, my habit of making myself small would make me an incredibly easy target. That is why she must have set up the trust. She knew she could not change the daily dynamics of the Varden house, so she built a financial fortress around my future instead, tying it to a milestone she hoped would find me old enough and hardened enough to defend myself. But as I navigated my teenage years, I did not feel like someone with a fortress. I just felt exceptionally tired. The constant daily effort of shrinking myself to fit into the negative space left by Callum and Noelle took a permanent toll on my personality. I stopped sharing my achievements entirely. When I scored in the top 1% on my state exams, I left the official letter on the kitchen island. Elena saw it 3 days later, offered a distracted compliment without looking up from her coffee, and immediately went back to arguing with Ross on the phone about Callum's college tuition. A heavy seed was firmly planted deep within my character during those years in Tucson. I grew into a young woman who was violently allergic to being a burden. I demanded absolutely nothing from my mother, from my stepfather, from anyone in that house. I asked for no money, no time, no emotional support, and no recognition. And the most devastating part of this dynamic was not that I stopped asking. The most devastating part was how quickly and how comfortably my family adapted to giving me nothing. They accepted my silence not as a quiet cry for help, but as a tremendous convenience. I trained them to forget me, and they proved to be exceptional, willing students. They spent over a decade assuming that my quiet compliance was a permanent state of being. They truly believed that the girl who had forged her own permissions slips and cooked her own dinners in the shadows of their chaos would simply sign away her grandmother's legacy without a second thought, just to keep the peace. They mistook my childhood survival mechanism for a lifelong weakness. I left the desert the moment I legally could. At 18 years old, I packed a single heavy suitcase, boarded a commercial flight, and traded the suffocating, dusty heat of Arizona for the crisp, thin air of Colorado. I had secured a full academic scholarship to a state university, double majoring in financial data analysis and internal control systems. It was a dense, unglamorous mouthful of a degree, but to me, it sounded like a golden roadmap to untouchable independence. I wanted to learn the mechanics of how the world actually operated, how resources were guarded, and most importantly, how to build a life that required absolutely zero subsidies from the Varden estate. College was a profound revelation. For the first time in my life, my inherent quietness was not a byproduct of being ignored by my family. It was a highly effective tactical tool. In the sprawling, anonymous lecture halls and the subterranean levels of the campus library, I discovered that I possessed a very specific, dangerous kind of intelligence. I was never the flashy, charismatic prodigy who raised their hand to argue abstract economic theory with tenured professors. I was the girl sitting in the back row who could stare at a dense wall of corporate financial statements for 5 straight hours and spot the single, deliberate misclassification hidden deep within the footnotes. I understood the architecture of deceit because I had spent my formative years observing how carefully people construct their own realities. When you grow up having to read the subtext of every room just to figure out how small you need to make yourself, you develop a terrifyingly sharp eye for the things people try to leave out of the frame. I knew how to look for the negative space. That quiet, predatory patience landed me a highly coveted internship at Silverline Integrity Group during my junior year. By the time I graduated, they had bypassed the standard probationary period and offered me a full-time position, The work was grueling, often requiring 60-hour weeks, but it made absolute logical sense to me. I spent my days hunting ghosts in the corporate machine. I traced fraudulent invoice chains, mapped out elaborate networks of offshore shell companies, and tracked down restricted funds that desperate executives had painstakingly disguised as legitimate consulting fees. I learned very quickly that money never actually disappears. It simply changes its clothes and moves to a different neighborhood. You just have to be willing to knock on every single door until you find it. My superiors rapidly realized I possessed an uncanny ability to smell systemic risk before the traditional warning signs even materialized on a standard audit report. Outside the high-rise glass walls of Silverline, I constructed a personal life that was aggressively stable. I rented a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet Denver neighborhood. I bought reliable, understated furniture. I cultivated a small circle of genuine, low-drama friends who did not demand more emotional bandwidth than I could comfortably give. I kept my spaces impeccably clean and my daily routines strictly predictable. I wrapped myself in a profound, heavy solitude. If you had asked me, I would have confidently told you that I had finally found peace. I called it peace because it was significantly easier than looking in the mirror and admitting that I was just deeply, fundamentally lonely. But it was a safe loneliness. It was a loneliness I completely controlled, which made it vastly superior to the crowded isolation of my childhood. My connection to the life I had left behind in Arizona withered down to the barest minimum required by societal convention. My relationship with my mother devolved entirely into a holiday affair. We spoke perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, usually a brief phone call on Thanksgiving morning, a rushed conversation on Christmas Eve, and occasionally, a random Sunday afternoon text. During these sparse interactions, she would launch into breathless, unprompted updates about her other children. I would sit on my Denver balcony, drinking black coffee, and listen to her brag about how Callum was launching yet another ambitious but vaguely defined startup venture, or how Noelle had just been accepted into an incredibly expensive out-of-state graduate program. I listened to these updates the same way one might listen to a podcast about minor, uninteresting celebrities. They were dispatches from a universe I no longer inhabited, featuring characters I barely recognized. I offered polite congratulations, asked no probing follow-up questions, and hung up the phone feeling nothing but a mild, lingering exhaustion. The only thread that still tethered my heart to the desert dirt was my grandmother. But 3 years into my career at Silverline, Rosa Diaz passed away quietly in her sleep. The news cracked my carefully constructed, sterile world right down the middle. I flew back for the funeral, standing at the edge of the dry earth, feeling more entirely orphaned than I ever had in my life. In the chaotic aftermath of the burial, while I was still numb with shock, Elena swiftly positioned herself as the competent executor of the estate. She cornered me in the dim hallway of the funeral home, her eyes dry and her tone brisk, assuring me that she was handling all the miserable legal paperwork so I would not have to stress about it. She told me there was nothing significant to worry about, just a few minor, disorganized bank accounts and an old life insurance policy that barely covered the exorbitant cost of the casket and the floral arrangements. She promised that everything was being settled quickly and efficiently. I should have asked to see the ledgers. The professional in me, the woman who tore apart corporate lies for a living, should have demanded an itemized accounting of every single asset my grandmother had left behind. But the granddaughter in me was drowning in a heavy, suffocating grief. I had just lost the only human being on the planet who had ever truly seen me. The only person who remembered the dates that mattered. The only one who had ever explicitly told me I was worth protecting. Because I was so thoroughly conditioned to accept the absolute minimum from my family, and because I was so desperately tired of fighting for space in their narrative. I simply nodded. I signed the preliminary funeral release forms she handed me in the hallway, packed my dark suit, and flew back to the snow in Colorado. I let her close the book on Rosa Diaz. That was my fatal mistake. I had treated my own family with a level of blind trust I would never, under any circumstances, extend to a corporate client. But sitting at my desk now, staring at the legal document my mother had just emailed me, That blind trust instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. All the years of tracing dirty money and dissecting fraudulent contracts clicked seamlessly into place. My professional instincts merged violently with my personal history. I looked at the name of my grandmother's trust glowing on the monitor, and then I looked at the waiver demanding my immediate, unquestioning surrender of all financial rights. The sudden urgency of my mother's phone call earlier that afternoon made perfect, horrifying sense. The fake, sugary warmth in her voice was not an olive branch. It was a deployment of tactics. The deliberate timing, reaching out exactly 7 days after I turned 30 years old, was not a coincidence. The desperate attempt to bypass my scrutiny by calling a massive legal waiver a routine administrative favor was exactly the kind of move a panicked embezzler makes right before the auditors arrive. I did not need a team of forensic accountants to tell me what was happening. The architecture of the deceit was staring me right in the face. My family was standing on the edge of a catastrophic financial cliff, and they were trying to use my signature as a blindfold and a bridge. They had not reached out to me because they wanted to heal our fractured relationship. They had not called me because they suddenly missed the daughter they had spent over 2 decades aggressively ignoring. They called me because I was the legal bottleneck. I was the final compliance checkpoint they could not bribe, charm, or bully their way past without a legally binding signature. They needed my legal standing, not my affection. As I sat in the glow of the dual monitors, listening to the soft hum of the Denver traffic outside my window, the last lingering trace of the compliant, easy child I used to be quietly died. My family had spent my entire life teaching me how to be perfectly self-sufficient. Now, they were about to find out exactly how well I had mastered the lesson. The stack of freshly printed paper sat on my dining table like an unexploded bomb. 52 pages. I had barely finished running a yellow highlighter over the indemnification clause when my phone lit up again. It had been less than 2 hours since Elena had sent the email. "Hi, sweetheart," Elena said, her voice breathy, rushing into the empty space before I even had a chance to say hello. "I saw the delivery receipt. Did you get a chance to open the file? Ross has the notary waiting on standby. You just need to print the very last page, sign it, and email a photo back. Super simple." "I read the file, Mom," I said. My voice was entirely flat. I stared at the yellow ink glaring back at me from the table. "You said this was a technicality for Ross and his refinancing. You did not mention the project was called Juniper Ridge, and you certainly did not mention that the collateral being leveraged belongs to a land trust in my grandmother's name." There was a sharp, static-filled pause on the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she scrambled to adjust her script. "Well, yes, the Rosa Diaz Trust," Elena said, her tone suddenly adopting a breezy, dismissive cadence. "That is exactly what I meant by old family paperwork. Juniper Ridge is a massive redevelopment project. It is going to revitalize a whole commercial sector. Ross has been working on it for 3 years. The bank just needs to clean up the title borders, and the trust holds a tiny, irrelevant adjacent parcel. We just need you to waive your procedural right to review the transfer so the lender can release the funds tomorrow morning. If it is my procedural right, I need to review the underlying assets," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Send me the original trust formation documents. I also want the tax returns and the historical ledgers for the trust going back to the date of its inception. I am not signing the last page of a 52-page commercial loan agreement without seeing the books." Elena let out a high, brittle laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of humor. "Oh, Brinley, you and your job. You always overcomplicate everything. You spend all day looking for criminals, so you think everyone is trying to trick you. This is your family. We are just asking you to help us close a deal. You are acting incredibly paranoid." "Send the ledgers," I repeated. "I cannot just conjure up decades of paperwork in one afternoon." Her voice cracked, the artificial warmth finally giving way to genuine frustration. "Ross needs this by tomorrow. Just sign the paper, please. I will talk to you later, Mom," I said, and ended the call. I tossed the phone onto the sofa and turned my full attention back to the documents. I did not need Elena to send me the formation papers to understand the trap I was standing in. The commercial loan agreement had to reference the trust's parameters to establish legality, which meant the answers were buried somewhere in the dense legal jargon I had printed. I went through the pages line by line. On page 34, hidden within a convoluted subsection detailing ownership structures, I found the exact phrasing I was looking for. The document explicitly defined the Rosa Diaz Land Trust as a single beneficiary entity. I was not one of several heirs. I was the only one. But the crucial detail, the one that made the blood pound in my ears, was the vesting schedule. The trust was designed to remain under the control of a designated trustee, my mother, until a specific, unalterable milestone was reached. The legal control, the right to audit, and the absolute ownership of whatever assets the trust held transferred to the beneficiary completely and irreversibly on her 30th birthday. I closed my eyes and let the timeline settle into place. The issue was no longer whether they had hidden the trust from me. It was how much damage they had done before control transferred on my 30th birthday. The waiver was not housekeeping. It was an attempt to erase the paper trail before I could audit it. At 7 o'clock that evening, my phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed Callum's name. I had not spoken to my stepbrother in nearly 2 years. The last time we interacted, he had been loudly complaining at a Thanksgiving dinner about how difficult it was to find loyal employees for his latest consulting firm. I answered, "Hello, Callum." "Hey, little sister." His voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with a loud, forced intimacy that made my skin crawl. "How is Denver treating you? Listen, Mom said you were getting a little bogged down in the legalese of the Juniper Ridge paperwork. I completely get it. It is a dense file. But I wanted to call and talk to you straight, just between us siblings." "Go ahead," I said. "This project is a game changer for the family. Bryn, Ross has millions tied up in this. I have contractors, architects, and site managers ready to break ground. We are talking about hundreds of jobs on the line. And the bank is threatening to pull the entire credit facility just because they need a clean title on that useless strip of dirt your grandmother left behind. The whole project could collapse. Brinley. Over one signature from my little sister." He was trying to make me feel responsible for a crisis I did not create. He was attempting to weaponize the concept of family loyalty, a concept he had never once applied to me when we were growing up. "I understand the stakes, Callum," I said softly. "Great. So you will sign it tonight?" "No," I replied. "I need time to review it." He exhaled sharply, the friendly facade dropping for a fraction of a second. "Bryn, come on. Do not be difficult just to punish Mom for whatever childhood grudge you are holding on to. People's livelihoods are at stake. I have to go. Callum," I hung up. Less than an hour later, at 9 o'clock, a text message chimed on my screen. It was from Noelle. She had not texted me since I moved to Colorado. "Hey, Bryn. Mom is so stressed about work. We all miss you so much. We feel terrible about missing your actual birthday. You should fly down this weekend. Let's do a big belated birthday dinner. Just the family. My treat. Love you." It was a masterclass in soft manipulation. Where Callum used guilt and urgency, Noelle used the promise of the one thing I had silently craved my entire life: inclusion. They were attacking the perimeter from every possible angle, trying to find the weak spot in my defenses. They thought I was still the quiet, accommodating girl who would trade anything for a seat at their table. I did not ignore them. Ignoring them would give them hope that I was just being passive. I needed to establish control of the timeline. I opened a group text message that included Elena, Ross, Callum, and Noelle. I typed a single, definitive sentence. "I am reviewing the Juniper Ridge file and the trust parameters. I need 48 hours to complete my assessment. I will not be signing anything before then." I hit send. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely abnormal. My phone began to light up like a distress beacon. Elena called twice in a row. Callum sent a barrage of texts in rapid succession, filled with exclamation points and aggressive corporate buzzwords. Ross, a man who had never once called my personal phone number, left a heavy breathing voicemail demanding I stop playing games with his business. Their panic was not the reaction of people who simply needed a routine favor. It was the visceral, terrifying panic of people who knew the floorboards were about to give way beneath their feet. I put my phone on silent and placed it face down on the kitchen counter. I walked over to the coffee maker and started brewing a dark roast. The apartment was completely silent save for the dripping of the coffee and the hum of the refrigerator. I carried my mug to the dining table and opened my laptop. I pushed the refinancing contract to the side and pulled up the public property records database for the state of Arizona. My family had asked me for a signature to save their future. Instead, I was going to do what I did best. I was going to treat my family exactly like a corporate client who had something to hide. I was going to follow the money. I brought up the county assessor's digital map on my left monitor. On my right monitor, I displayed the surveyor's appendix from the refinancing package my mother had sent me. I spent the first hour simply cross-referencing the geographical coordinates. Elena had deliberately described the trust's property as a tiny, irrelevant adjacent parcel, a phrase designed to sound like a useless patch of dirt catching tumbleweeds on the edge of the desert. But as the digital map rendered the colored zoning lines across my screen, the absolute brilliance of my grandmother's foresight materialized before my eyes. Ross's Juniper Ridge development was a massive, sprawling acreage zoned for high-density mixed-use commercial and residential buildings. It was a project designed to print money, but it had a fatal geographical flaw. The entire multi-million-dollar expanse was boxed in by a federally protected wildlife corridor on 3 sides and a major state highway on the 4th. The state highway had no direct legal off-ramp to Ross's land. The only legal point of ingress and egress, the absolute mandatory access road required by county fire codes and municipal zoning laws to break ground, ran in a straight line directly through a narrow rectangular parcel of land. That parcel was owned entirely by the Rosa Diaz Land Trust. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the digital boundary lines with my index finger. Without that specific piece of land, Ross could not lay a single foot of pavement. The bank would never fund a landlocked project, and the county would never issue the construction permits. I was not a minor technicality helping to beautify a loan application. I was the absolute, singular linchpin holding up the entire architectural blueprint. Without my grandmother's land, Juniper Ridge was completely worthless. I shifted my focus from the dirt to the money. The refinancing package included a heavily redacted historical summary of the trust to prove its good standing to the commercial lenders. To a layman, the summary looked like standard administrative overhead. But when you spend 40 hours a week hunting financial phantoms for a living, you learn that redactions and vague line items are just neon signs pointing directly to the crime scene. I looked closely at the operational expenses. Over the past decade, the trust had bled an astonishing amount of cash through exorbitant recurring property management fees. According to the ledger, these payments were routed to a series of opaque consulting firms with aggressively generic names like Horizon Strategic Advisors and Summit Capital Solutions. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the corporate registration database for the state of Arizona. I pulled the original filing documents for Summit Capital Solutions. It was registered to a nameless agent service, a common tactic to obscure ownership, but amateurs always leave a digital fingerprint somewhere. I pulled the initial capitalization records and found a transfer from a parent limited liability company. I recognized the name of that parent company instantly. It was the exact corporate entity my stepbrother had used to launch his boutique tech startup 5 years ago. I stared at the glowing letters on the screen, a bitter taste rising in the back of my throat. For years, the family had loudly and constantly bragged at every holiday dinner about how Callum was a self-made entrepreneur, how he had built his business from scratch through sheer grit and bootstrapping. He had not built it from scratch. He had built his arrogance and his failed startup using my grandmother's money, siphoned quietly out of the trust by my mother. Once I found the first leak in the plumbing, the rest of the dam broke violently. I began matching the dates of the largest cash disbursements from the trust against the timeline of my family's major life events. One massive withdrawal, totaling over $85,000, was labeled as an emergency environmental survey fee. The date of that withdrawal coincided perfectly with the exact month my stepsister packed her bags and moved across the country for an incredibly expensive, out-of-state private university graduate program. Another set of heavy withdrawals, drawn under the guise of prolonged legal consulting and land maintenance, matched the exact spring my mother decided the Varden estate required a complete structural overhaul. I remembered the phone calls from that year. Elena complaining about the dust while contractors added a custom sunroom, a new pool deck, and imported Italian marble countertops to her kitchen. They had not just mismanaged the trust, they had treated my inheritance like a bottomless secret slush fund. They had systematically drained my grandmother's legacy to subsidize their golden children and to flawlessly maintain the illusion of their limitless suburban prosperity. All the while, I was living hundreds of miles away, quietly budgeting my own grocery bills and taking pride in my fierce independence, completely unaware that I was unknowingly funding their luxury. I needed to know why they were panicking right now. I shifted my investigation to Ross Varden. I pulled the public court records, the county lien registries, and the commercial debt filings for his primary holding companies. The picture that emerged from the data was breathtaking in its desperation. Ross was not a titan of industry finalizing a triumphant deal. He was a man suffocating underwater. Juniper Ridge was being kept alive by predatory, short-term mezzanine loans carrying interest rates north of 15%. These were loans of last resort, the kind of debt developers take on only when traditional banks lock them out. Worse, he had massive balloon payments coming due in a matter of days, and two of his other commercial properties were currently buckling under pending property tax liens. He was completely illiquid. The massive refinancing package my mother had sent me was not just a business expansion, it was a life raft. If the commercial lender did not wire the new funds by the end of the week, Ross's predatory lenders were going to seize the collateral, foreclose on his properties, and his entire meticulously curated empire would instantly collapse into dust. I sat back in my chair. The clock on the wall read 2 o'clock in the morning. My coffee had gone completely cold. The most agonizing part of this entire discovery was not the stolen money. I had spent my entire adult life learning how to survive without their financial support. The true, unforgivable brutality lay in the cold, mathematical precision of their timeline. They had known exactly what they were doing for 2 decades. They had drained the trust dry, fully aware that a legal clock was ticking relentlessly toward my 30th birthday. They had meticulously calculated the exact hour my legal rights as the sole beneficiary would activate. The forgotten birthday, the delayed text message at 11:52 at night, the sudden desperate phone call a week later under the guise of a tiny favor. It was all a perfectly choreographed legal strategy. They had banked their entire survival on the assumption that they had sufficiently beaten my self-esteem down over the years. They assumed I was still the invisible, undemanding girl who would never dare ask for a receipt, who would just sign the waiver to avoid causing a scene. They thought my lifelong silence was a permanent guarantee of my blind compliance. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my cold coffee against the drywall or call my mother to demand a tearful confession. Anger is a messy, undisciplined emotion that gives your opponent an opening to manipulate you. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a lonely woman waiting for her family to remember her. It was the silence of a predator who had just locked onto a scent. I created a new, encrypted folder on my laptop desktop. I began to download every single public record, every property plat map, every corporate registration filing, and every fraudulent line item from the loan package. I meticulously converted the digital breadcrumbs into an undeniable, chronological, legally binding narrative of fraud. My phone sat completely dark on the kitchen counter, filled with their panicked missed calls and manipulative text messages. Let them sweat. Let them look at their watches and wonder why the easy child was not answering. In the Varden household, my silence had always been interpreted as submission. They were about to learn the hard way that in my line of work, silence does not mean you are retreating. It means you are quietly assembling the evidence for an execution. I sat across the heavy mahogany desk from Mara Keene, an independent estate attorney I had hired the morning after my late-night audit of the family files. Mara was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, assessing eyes and a demeanor that offered zero room for sentimentality. She did not deal in family drama. She dealt in the rigid, unforgiving architecture of trust law. I had spent 2 hours walking her through the digital files, the property plat maps, and the historical timeline of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust. Mara folded her hands over the printed documents I had brought her. Her expression was grim. She confirmed everything my professional instincts had screamed at me the night before. According to state law, the absolute second the clock struck midnight on the day I turned 30 years old, Elena was legally obligated to initiate a complete handover. She had a strict window of 30 days to provide me with a comprehensive, unredacted accounting report of every single transaction that had occurred within the trust since its inception. "They are not just disorganized, Brinley," Mara said, her voice entirely flat. "There are gaping holes in these ledgers, entire years where the statements are simply missing. The withdrawal velocity does not match any legitimate property management strategy. This has crossed the border from a family misunderstanding straight into actionable, severe legal peril for your mother and your stepfather." I nodded, feeling a strange, hollow calmness. But the true depth of their betrayal did not hit me until Mara slid a specific, isolated page across the desk. It was an internal routing slip, buried deep within the supplementary appendices of the loan package Elena had sent me. "Did you sign this preliminary consent form?" Mara asked, tapping a manicured fingernail against the bottom of the page. I stared at the ink. It was my name. It was my signature. But the moment I looked closely at the loop of the letter Y and the sharp, hurried slant of the final Z, my stomach dropped. I had not signed my name like that in nearly a decade. It was the exact signature I had used during my sophomore year of college, back when I was hastily signing financial aid renewals and cheap apartment leases. Someone in Ross Varden's orbit had digitized an old piece of my paperwork, cropped my signature, and pasted it onto an internal file as a placeholder. It was a terrifyingly clear indication that they had prepared a contingency plan. They had weaponized my past against my present. They had a forged template ready, just in case the compliant, easy daughter suddenly decided to ask questions. They only needed my fresh, notarized signature now because the commercial lender required a live digital trace for a transaction of this magnitude. Walking out of Mara's office into the bright, freezing Denver morning, my entire past underwent a violent, retrospective translation. Every seemingly innocuous memory from my childhood twisted into something sinister. I remembered the countless times I would sit at the kitchen island, doing my homework, while Elena slid a stack of administrative papers toward me. "Just sign this right here, honey. Do not worry about the grown-up stuff." I remembered the soft, appreciative pats on the head when I did not ask for a breakdown of my college fund. I remembered the family's favorite, repeating mantra, "Brinley is our easiest child." It had never been a compliment. It was an inventory assessment. My easy nature was not a personality trait they admired. It was a natural resource they ruthlessly harvested. Because I demanded so little of their attention, they had the darkness and the quiet they needed to hide the theft of my future. They had groomed me for financial illiteracy, relying on my desperate desire to avoid being a burden. The only miscalculation they made was that I grew up to be a woman who hunts anomalies for a living. That afternoon, I logged on to a virtual therapy session with Dr. Morel Hart. I had been seeing her intermittently for 2 years, mostly to manage the low-level, ambient anxiety that came with my high-stress corporate job. I had rarely spoken to her about my family, preferring to keep those old ghosts locked in the basement. But that day, I laid the entire architecture of the betrayal out on the virtual table. I explained the forgotten birthday, the sudden demand for a signature, the drained trust, and the forged placeholder document. I expected to feel an overwhelming surge of rage while saying it out loud, but instead, I just felt a profound, exhausting sorrow. Dr. Hart listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me through the screen, her expression filled with a quiet, piercing empathy. "You grew up in an environment where your needs were treated as an inconvenience," she said softly. "You adapted to survive that, but being forgotten for too long makes a person confuse genuine maturity with the absolute terror of needing anyone. You learned how to starve quietly, Brinley, and your family was more than happy to let you think that starving was a sign of strength." Her words stripped away the final, protective layer of denial I had wrapped around myself. I had always worn my fierce independence like a suit of armor, proud that I never had to ask Elena or Ross for a single dime. But Dr. Hart was right. It was not armor. It was an exile I had volunteered for, and they had profited from my absence. Later that evening, I sat in the corner booth of a quiet downtown coffee shop with my closest friend, Adrian Wells. Adrian was a senior architect at a local firm, a man who understood structural integrity better than anyone I knew. I pushed a printout of the trust ledgers across the wooden table. Adrian studied the numbers in silence. He did not offer performative outrage or urge me to burn my mother's house to the ground. He possessed a deeply grounded, practical loyalty. "They are going to tell you that you are destroying the family if you do not sign this," Adrian said, tapping his finger against the paper. "They are going to use every ounce of guilt they can manufacture. But helping someone build a house is one thing, Brinley. Letting them use your bones to patch their crumbling foundation is another. You are not a human band-aid for their mistakes." I looked down at my cold tea. Adrian had articulated the exact boundary line I needed to draw. Helping meant providing assistance from a place of surplus and respect. What they were demanding was a sacrifice to cover up a crime. I went back to my apartment and completely shut off my phone. I ignored the escalating digital panic emanating from Arizona. I did not explode over a text message. I did not call Elena to scream into the receiver, giving her the opportunity to cry and manipulate the narrative. I channeled every ounce of my hurt into absolute, terrifying precision. I spent the next 2 days building a physical binder. I used heavy-duty cardstock, color-coded index tabs, and bright yellow highlighters. I printed out the state trust statutes, the missing ledger gaps, the property plat maps, proving my land was the sole access point for Juniper Ridge, and the public records linking the trust's suspicious management fees directly to Callum's failed startup. I built an undeniable, airtight portfolio of their deceit. I transformed my emotional devastation into a weapon of pure, unadulterated fact. On Friday morning, exactly 10 days after I turned 30 years old, I finally turned my phone back on. There were dozens of unread messages and frantic voicemails. I ignored all of them. I opened the group text thread containing my mother, my stepfather, my stepbrother, and my stepsister. I typed a single, non-negotiable directive. "I will be driving down to Arizona this weekend. I will meet you at the house on Sunday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I require the presence of everyone in this chat. I also require the physical, original copies of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust formation documents, as well as the unredacted bank statements for the last 10 years. Do not prepare food. Do not buy a cake. This is not a family dinner. If any of these conditions are not met, my next meeting will be with the State Attorney General." I hit send, booked a rental car, and packed my evidence binder. I was finally going home, but I was no longer the easy child. I was the auditor, and the books were incredibly dirty. The moment my ultimatum landed in their group chat, the digital bombardment escalated from a frantic scramble into an all-out siege. Wednesday morning, my phone began ringing at 7 o'clock and did not stop until well past midnight. Elena was the first wave. She called me twice on Wednesday, 3 times on Thursday, and again on Friday morning. Her voice was no longer masked in that artificial sugary warmth. It was thick with tears, a wet, desperate sound that used to make me drop everything and rush to her side when I was a child. She offered apologies that were entirely shapeless. She said she was sorry that I felt left out. Sorry that things were so complicated with the estate. Sorry that the distance between Colorado and Arizona had grown so vast. but every single tearful monologue inevitably circled back to the exact same destination. "You just need to sign it, Brinley," she sobbed into the receiver on Thursday evening. "Just sign the paper and everything will be fine. We can fix whatever is broken between us. I promise. But I need you to do this one little thing first." It was a transaction disguised as a reconciliation. I let her cry, keeping my responses strictly monosyllabic, refusing to give her the comfort of an argument. When Elena failed to break my silence, they sent in Callum. The fake, boisterous, brotherly affection he had attempted to use earlier in the week completely vanished. He called me on Friday afternoon from a loud, echoing space that sounded like an active construction site. "You are being incredibly stubborn, Brinley," he snapped, his voice hard and metallic over the speakerphone. "You think you are making some profound moral point, but you are actually just destroying people's lives. I have over 4 dozen union workers contracted for this site. Plumbers, electricians, heavy machinery operators. If the bank pulls the financing because you want to throw a temper tantrum over a piece of dirt, those men do not get paid. You are going to put dozens of families on the street just to punish us." He was trying to make me the villain in a narrative he had written. He wanted me to carry the weight of his financial mismanagement. I simply ended the call without saying a single word. Then came Ross. He did not bother calling when he knew I was awake. He left a heavy, suffocating voicemail at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. His voice was a terrifying blend of pleading and threatening. The sound of a cornered animal trying to sound like a predator. "I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing," Ross growled into the recording. "But this is not a joke. If Juniper Ridge collapses, the cross-collateralization kicks in. The bank will take the corporate offices. They will take the investment accounts. They will take the house. Your mother will lose her $1 million home. Brinley, I do not think that is something you want to force her to live with. Call the notary. Sign the document." I sat in the dark of my kitchen, listening to his heavy breathing before the recording clicked off. A cold, insidious exhaustion crept into my bones. For a brief, terrifying moment, my resolve flickered. I thought about my mother losing the sprawling house she loved so much, the lifelong conditioning, the desperate urge to simply fold myself into a small shape and fix the problem for them, pulled tightly at my chest. It would be so incredibly easy to just print the final page, scribble my name, and go back to my quiet, isolated life in Denver. I reached out and hovered my finger over the screen to call Elena. Right at that second, my screen illuminated with a direct message notification. It was not in the family group chat. It was a private text from Noelle. "Bryn, do not sign anything yet. Check your email. I just sent you something I found on the family desktop in the study." My brow furrowed. I walked over to my laptop, opened my personal inbox, and found an email from Noelle with a single image file attached. It was a photograph taken of a computer monitor, showing an archived email chain between Elena and Ross. The timestamp on the email was from exactly 4 years ago, shortly after my grandmother passed away. I zoomed in on the glowing text. It was an email written entirely by my mother, Ross. "I moved the management fees through Callum's company like we discussed. But we cannot tell Brinley about the parameters of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust. Not yet. She does not ask questions, and the more she stays completely out of it, the easier it is to handle the money when we need it. If she knows she's the sole beneficiary, she might want to look at the books. We will deal with it when she turns 30. I read the paragraph 3 times. The air in my apartment turned freezing cold. For my entire life, I had operated under the assumption that Ross was the mastermind. I had always believed that my mother was simply weak, that she had been swept up in his aggressive ambition and was too passive to protect me. I had spent 2 decades making excuses for her, telling myself she just did not know how to stand up to a forceful man. But the words on the screen destroyed that illusion permanently. Elena was not a bystander. She was the architect. She had actively participated in keeping me in the dark because my ignorance was highly convenient for her. She had chosen to sacrifice my inheritance to maintain her wealthy lifestyle and fund her stepson's vanity projects. A second text from Noelle chimed on my phone. I swear to you, Brinley, I did not know that land was only yours. Mom and Dad always told Callum and me that Grandma Rosa left a joint trust for the whole family, and that they were just managing it for all of us. I thought the money they gave me for grad school was from a general family fund. I am so sorry. Noelle's confession did not suddenly absolve her of a lifetime of ignoring me. It did not transform her into a saint overnight, but it fundamentally shifted the battlefield. It created the very first structural crack in the Varden family's united front. They had always operated as an impenetrable wall when it came to exploiting my absence. Now, one of their own had broken rank. I looked back at the photograph of my mother's email. The more she stays completely out of it, the easier it is to handle. The lingering guilt I had felt after Ross's voicemail completely evaporated. The urge to save them vanished, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard focus. They wanted to use the pressure of a deadline to break me. I decided to use that exact same weapon against them. I opened the group chat. I deleted my previous message about meeting them at the house on Sunday afternoon. A private confrontation in their living room was no longer sufficient. They would just yell, cry, and try to bury the truth under thick layers of family history. I needed an environment where their lies had immediate, devastating legal consequences. A place where they could not simply gaslight their way out of the room. I knew from the refinancing documents that Ross's commercial loan was scheduled to close at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning at the offices of the title company. I typed a new message. Plans have changed. I am not coming to the house on Sunday. Since this is a matter of commercial refinancing, we will handle it professionally. I will see all of you at the title company's office on Monday morning at 8:30, exactly 30 minutes before your closing meeting. Have the original trust ledgers on the table. I sent the text and immediately turned off the device. I did not need to see their replies. I packed my evidence binder into my leather briefcase. I was going to walk into the absolute center of their financial empire, right at the exact moment they needed the money the most, and I was going to let the truth do its job. I drove a rented sedan through the wide, palm-lined streets of Gilbert on Sunday afternoon. Despite my text message moving our final meeting to the title company on Monday morning, the physical pull of the past demanded a different sequence. I needed to look my mother in the eye inside the very walls where I had been systematically erased, before I dismantled their empire in a corporate boardroom. Adrian sat in the passenger seat, his presence a quiet, grounding weight. When I pulled up to the sprawling Varden estate, he did not unbuckle his seatbelt. He looked at the massive double doors and then at me. "I will be right here," he said. "Take all the time you need, but do not let them trap you in there." I nodded, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked up the paved driveway alone. The house still projected an aggressive aura of wealthy suburban perfection, but up close, the illusion was fracturing. The meticulously manicured hedges were overgrown. The paint around the window frames was peeling. The heavy silence hanging over the property was not peaceful. It was the suffocating stillness of a ship taking on water. I pushed open the front door. They were all waiting in the open-concept living room. The air smelled heavily of vanilla and spun sugar. Elena was standing near the kitchen island, holding a white bakery box. A pathetic, brightly lit birthday cake sat on the marble counter. It was a desperate, grotesque attempt to stage a heartwarming family tableau, while the floorboards were literally rotting beneath their feet. "Brinley," Elena gasped, her voice trembling with forced relief. She took a step forward, her arms half raised. "You came. Oh, sweetie, we got your favorite. We just wanted to celebrate you properly before we get into all that boring paperwork stuff." I stopped at the edge of the living room rug. I did not drop my briefcase. I did not return her smile. "Put the cake away, Mom." Elena froze. "Honey, please, let us just sit down as a family." "We are not a family, fine," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, sweet air like a scalpel. "And this is not about a forgotten birthday. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending a vanilla cake is going to fix 20 years of being pushed to the absolute bottom of your priority list." Ross let out a loud, theatrical sigh from his leather armchair. Callum stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed defensively. Noelle sat on the edge of the sofa, her eyes darting nervously between us. Elena's face crumpled. The fake smile vanished, replaced by the wet, trembling mask of a victim. I am sorry, Brinley. I am so sorry you feel like we did not celebrate you enough. I know things were chaotic when you were growing up, but I did the best I could. Stop, I commanded. Stop telling me you are sorry I feel a certain way. That is a coward's apology. I want you to name exactly what you did. She blinked, tears finally spilling over her mascara. What do you want me to say? I want you to admit that you chose them. I pointed at Callum and Noelle. Every single day, I want you to admit that when Callum failed 3 classes, you spent weeks holding his hand. But when I won the state debate tournament, you did not even bother to show up to the auditorium. I want you to say out loud that you spent my entire childhood treating my independence not as a strength, but as a massive convenience, so you could focus all your energy on your new husband's children. The room was dead silent. Elena looked at the floor, her shoulders shaking. It was hard. Brinley, Ross needed me. The kids needed me. You were always so strong. You never asked for anything. Because I knew you would not give it to me, I fired back, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. You groomed me to be silent. And then you decided that because I was silent, I would make the perfect victim for your financial theft. All right, that is enough, Ross interrupted, his deep voice booming across the room. He stood up, towering over the coffee table, projecting the aggressive patriarchal authority he used to intimidate contractors. We are not doing this emotional circus. Your mother is crying. You made your point. Now let us talk about practical solutions. We need that signature. Brinley, you are holding up millions of dollars over a childhood grudge. I turned my gaze entirely to him. I unclasped my leather briefcase, pulled out the heavy color-coded binder, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a loud crack. Practical solutions, I repeated coldly. I flipped the binder open to the first tab. Let us talk about the practical application of $85,000 drawn from the Rosa Diaz Land Trust exactly 4 years ago. The ledger calls it an environmental survey. But the date matches the exact week Noelle moved across the country for graduate school. Ross's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, but I did not let him speak. I flipped to the next tab. Let us talk about the recurring management fees, totaling over $120,000, paid directly to a shell company registered to Callum, a company that had 0 active clients other than my grandmother's trust. You did not build a startup. Callum, you lived on an allowance stolen from my inheritance. Callum's face drained of color. He looked wildly at his father, the confident corporate persona instantly shattering. You have no idea how complex managing these assets is, Ross growled, stepping forward, his hands balled into fists. We preserved the land. We kept the estate afloat. We did what we had to do to protect this family. You protected yourself, I said, staring him down without blinking. You used my grandmother's money as a slush fund to hide your own catastrophic business failures. You forged a placeholder signature on internal documents because you knew you were committing fraud. You waited until my 30th birthday to call me, hoping I was still the pathetic, desperate girl who would sign anything just to get a scrap of my mother's affection. That is a lie, Elena sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I never wanted to hurt you. Mom, stop it, a voice rang out. Everyone turned. Noelle stood up from the sofa. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Elena, then at Ross. She is not lying, Noelle said, her voice shaking but resolute. I saw the emails. I saw the messages you sent Dad about keeping Brinley in the dark. You deliberately hid it from her. Ross turned his fury on his daughter. Sit down and shut your mouth. Noelle, you do not understand what is happening here. I understand that you stole from her, Noelle shot back, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at me. I thought the money you gave me was yours. If I had known it was Brinley's, I never would have taken a single dime. I am so sorry. Bryn. The alignment of the room fractured completely. For 2 decades, the Varden family had been a united, impenetrable fortress. Now, the walls were coming down from the inside. Elena looked at Noelle in absolute shock, her carefully constructed narrative of a happy, unified family collapsing in real time. Ross realized he had lost control of the emotional narrative. His face hardened into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He abandoned the pretense of being a reasonable father figure and reverted to the cornered animal I had heard on the voicemail. "Fine," Ross spat, his voice dropping to a vicious, gravelly register. "You want to play the auditor? Play the auditor. But the truth is, we have the final closing meeting with Redstone Capital tomorrow morning at 8:30. If you do not sign that waiver by the time the bank opens, the mezzanine lenders will seize everything: this house, the cars, the corporate accounts, everything. Your mother will be bankrupt and living on the street. If you walk out that door without signing, the consequences are unfixable, and it will be entirely your fault." He pointed a thick finger at my face, expecting me to shrink back, expecting the lifelong conditioning of guilt to finally paralyze me. Instead, a profound, icy calm settled over my chest. I looked at his red, furious face, and then I looked at my mother, who was weeping uncontrollably into her hands, entirely unwilling to take responsibility for her own survival. Ross's threat was not a deterrent. It was the exact confirmation I had driven hundreds of miles to hear. "I will see you tomorrow morning at 8:30, I said quietly. I closed my binder, picked up my briefcase, and walked out the front door, leaving the vanilla cake and the wreckage of my childhood entirely behind me. The conference room at the title company was a sterile expanse of polished chrome and floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the downtown Phoenix skyline. At 8:30 in the morning, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady note, completely detached from the emotional wreckage of the previous afternoon. I walked in right on time. Mara Keene walked beside me, her leather briefcase swinging with the weight of absolute legal authority. The room was already full. Representatives from Redstone Capital, the commercial lending firm underwriting the Juniper Ridge project, sat on one side of the massive oak table. 2 escrow officers from the title company sat at the head. On the opposite side sat my family. Ross wore a sharply tailored navy suit, exuding the easy, aggressive confidence of a man who believed he could charm his way out of a burning building. Callum sat next to him, furiously tapping on his phone. Elena was there too, looking small and intensely fragile in a designer blazer, refusing to make eye contact with me. Ross stood up the moment we entered, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile at the Redstone bankers. Here she is," Ross announced, gesturing expansively toward me. "My stepdaughter, Brinley. Gentlemen, I apologize again for the slight administrative delay. You know how it is when you try to wrangle adult children who live out of state. It is just a minor family misunderstanding regarding some ancient estate paperwork, but we are all here to clear the air and finalize the title transfer this morning." He was trying to shrink me. He was trying to frame my presence as the petulant stalling of an uninformed child, rather than the calculated arrival of a forensic auditor. I did not correct him. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and folded my hands on the table. Mara sat beside me and placed a thick stack of manila folders on the polished wood. "Let us get right to it, then," the lead banker from Redstone Capital said, adjusting his glasses. "We have a hard funding deadline at noon today. Mr. Varden, you indicated that the Rosa Diaz Land Trust waiver would be fully executed this morning, granting us the unencumbered lien on the access parcel." "Absolutely," Ross said smoothly. "Brinley just had a few procedural questions she wanted answered before we notarized the final page." "I do have a few questions," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly across the oak table. I looked directly at the lead banker, completely ignoring Ross. "Before I sign away my exclusive rights as the sole beneficiary of the trust, I need the current trustee to clarify a few operational details on the record." I turned my gaze to Elena. She flinched. "Mom," I started, using the word purely as a tactical label rather than a term of endearment. Could you confirm for the representatives of Redstone Capital exactly what year you became aware that my legal right to an unredacted accounting of the trust would activate upon my turning 30 years old? Ross shifted in his leather chair. Brinley, this is neither the time nor the place for a probate discussion. We are here to close a commercial loan. If you are using my land as collateral, this is exactly the time and the place, I replied, never taking my eyes off Elena. When did you know the deadline? Elena swallowed hard. She looked at Ross, begging silently for a lifeline, but Redstone Capital was watching. Lying in front of commercial underwriters is a federal offense. I knew when your grandmother drafted the paperwork, she whispered. So you have known for over a decade, I stated clearly. And could you also confirm your scope of authority regarding the disbursement of trust capital? Were you explicitly authorized to route property management fees to companies owned by your immediate family members without any competitive bidding process or fair market valuation? The color completely drained from Callum's face. The Redstone bankers stopped taking notes and looked up, their expressions suddenly hardening into masks of sharp corporate caution. Hold on a minute, Callum interjected, his voice pitching higher than normal. That is an internal family matter. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Juniper Ridge land collateral. It has everything to do with the fiduciary standing of the person signing the pledge agreement, Mara Keene said smoothly, speaking for the first time. She opened her first folder and slid 4 crisp copies of a preliminary accounting reconciliation across the table to the bankers. Gentlemen, my client just turned 30 years old a little over a week ago. Upon reviewing the trust, we discovered severe irregularities. We are looking at a 10-year history of unverified cash withdrawals, missing quarterly reports, and a systemic pattern of using a protected beneficiary trust as a private liquidity cushion for Mr. Varden's commercial enterprises. Ross slammed his hand on the table. That is a slanderous, baseless accusation. You are trying to sabotage a multi-million-dollar development over a few late tax filings. We are not sabotaging anything, I said calmly. You built a house on land you do not own, using money you did not earn. I am just reading the blueprints. One of the title agents, a young woman looking increasingly nervous, slid a draft copy of the final meeting minutes and the proposed waiver toward my side of the table. Miss Diaz, we had a preliminary file drafted just in case you were ready to proceed. It includes the addendums your stepfather's legal team submitted yesterday afternoon. I pulled the file toward me. I flipped past the cover sheet and stopped on the 3rd page. There, buried in an internal review section, meant only for the title company's eyes, was a digital mock-up of the final execution page. I stared at the bottom line. Sitting right there on the signature block, ready to be merged into the final, legally binding file, was the exact same scanned, 10-year-old signature I had discovered in my initial audit. They had actually submitted the forged placeholder to the title company to keep the approval process moving while they desperately tried to bully me into providing a real one. I felt a cold, sharp thrill of intellectual satisfaction. They had just handed me the murder weapon. I spun the document around and pushed it to the center of the table, tapping my index finger directly on the forged ink. I have not signed a single document regarding this loan, I said, my voice dropping to a register of pure, lethal ice. So perhaps Mr. Varden or his team can explain to the Redstone underwriters why a cropped digital forgery of my signature from a decade-old college lease is currently sitting in the title company's pre-closing file? The lead banker leaned forward, his eyes widening as he recognized the clear pixelation around the edges of the digital ink. Callum panicked. The polished facade shattered instantly. That was not us, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the air. That was the outsourced accounting firm. They must have pulled an old file by mistake to prep the workflow. It was a clerical error by a third-party vendor. Which third-party vendor? I asked immediately, not giving him a single second to breathe. Summit Capital Solutions, Callum blurted out, grabbing the first corporate name that came to his terrified mind. They handle the administrative overflow. I did not even look at my binder. I just looked at him with absolute pity. Summit Capital Solutions is not an accounting firm. Callum, I said softly. It is a limited liability company registered in the state of Arizona. And according to the State Corporation Commission filings I pulled 48 hours ago, the sole managing member of its parent company is you. You just blamed your own shell company for forging a federal loan document. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a massive structural collapse. The lead banker from Redstone Capital stood up. He did not look angry. He looked terrified of the liability radiating from Ross Varden's side of the table. He gathered his briefcases with swift, jerky movements. Redstone Capital is halting all funding activities effective immediately, the banker announced, his tone entirely robotic. We are opening a full internal fraud review into the Juniper Ridge application. Furthermore, the bank will not authorize any transfer, pledge, or encumbrance of the access parcel unless the sole beneficiary of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust formally withdraws all objections in writing. The bankers walked out of the room, followed closely by the pale, silent title agents. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving just my family, Mara, and me in the freezing room. Ross looked completely hollowed out. The arrogant developer was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of total financial ruin. Elena was quietly weeping into a tissue, completely incapable of looking me in the eye. You have one way out, I said, breaking the silence. My voice held absolutely no malice, only the cold reality of mathematics. You will publicly admit to the title company and the lenders that the trust was misused. You will fully refund every single dollar drawn for non-essential purposes over the last 10 years, restoring my grandmother's capital. You will legally remove my name and my land from every single liability tied to the Varden estate, and you will never, ever call me to fix your mistakes again. You sign a confession of mismanagement, and I will sign a document allowing you to buy the access parcel from me at triple the market rate. That is your only path forward. Ross's face contorted into a mask of pure wounded pride. For 20 years, he had been the absolute king of his castle. The idea of signing a legal confession, of admitting total defeat to the quiet, invisible girl he had spent decades ignoring, was a humiliation he could not swallow. His ego overrode his survival instinct. I am not signing a confession for you, Ross hissed, his voice shaking with venom. I will find another lender. I will find a loophole. You are not going to extort me. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical closure. Good luck with the mezzanine lenders. Ross, I said. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the glass room, leaving them exactly where they had always left me, entirely on their own to face the consequences. The 48 hours following the implosion at the title company were a masterclass in desperate delusion. Ross Varden refused to accept that the foundation of his empire had just turned to dust. He spent 2 full days pacing the hardwood floors of his sprawling Gilbert estate, barking orders into his cell phone, trying to bully alternative lenders into covering the massive shortfall. He cornered my mother constantly, demanding she call me, insisting that if they just applied enough emotional pressure, if Elena just cried hard enough, the easy daughter would eventually soften and drop the legal barricade. He truly believed my lifelong habit of yielding was a permanent biological trait, but I was not yielding. I had already struck the fatal blow. Before I even reached my rental car in the parking lot of the title company that Monday morning, Mara Keene had electronically filed a formal injunction with the county court. We officially disputed any proposed transfer of the Rosa Diaz Land Trust parcel and submitted an emergency petition to remove Elena as the managing trustee, citing gross fiduciary negligence. The legal net was completely pulled tight before Ross even made it back to his house. By Wednesday morning, the walls were closing in rapidly. Ross convened an emergency video conference with his remaining junior partners in Callum, desperately trying to spin the Redstone Capital disaster as a minor clerical hiccup. He claimed he was merely the victim of sloppy bookkeeping by an outsourced vendor, aggressively maintaining the fiction that he had absolutely no knowledge of the forged signatures sitting in the escrow file. That was the exact moment Noelle delivered the final, crushing blow. She did not yell. She simply forwarded a single, archived email to the entire executive team, the legal counsel, and me. It was a message Ross had sent to his project manager 2 years prior, long before the refinancing crisis had even peaked. The text was undeniable. Ross had written clear instructions to his staff. Prepare the digital signature file for Brinley Diaz in advance, so we do not waste any time waiting for her to physically sign when we finally get her to agree to the easement. It was the smoking gun of premeditation. It instantly annihilated Ross's desperate defense that the forgery was a vendor's mistake. He had not just panicked in the final hour. He had planned to bypass my legal consent for years. The distribution of that email broke the final strut holding up my mother's deeply ingrained denial. Elena had spent 2 decades convincing herself that her husband was a flawed but ultimately protective provider, and that her complicity in hiding my inheritance was just a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of our blended family. But staring at the undeniable proof of his calculated criminality, the illusion finally shattered. On Thursday afternoon, Elena walked into Mara Keene's office in downtown Phoenix without Ross. She looked exhausted, completely stripped of the artificial suburban polish she had maintained for so long. She sat down across from my attorney and signed a sworn, legally binding affidavit. In stark, black and white ink, my mother officially admitted to deliberately concealing my status as the sole beneficiary of the trust. She confessed to authorizing the exorbitant management fees routed to Callum's shell companies to maintain the Varden family's affluent lifestyle, fully aware that the money belonged exclusively to me. Reading that affidavit did not magically heal the canyon of hurt between us. A piece of paper cannot retroactively attend high school graduations or rewrite a childhood spent in the shadows. But as I held the document in my hands, I felt a profound tectonic shift in my chest. For the very first time in 20 years, Elena had chosen the brutal, unvarnished truth about her daughter over the comfortable, wealthy lie of her husband. She had finally stopped protecting him. The fallout was swift and absolute, with the access parcel permanently locked behind my legal injunction and the fraud exposed. Juniper Ridge collapsed entirely on Friday afternoon. The commercial investors immediately pulled their backing. The mezzanine lenders, sensing the blood in the water, executed their default clauses. By the following Monday, the notices of foreclosure were taped to the glass doors of Ross's corporate offices. The cascading cross-collateralization wiped them out. The sprawling estate in Gilbert, the house where I had learned to make myself invisible, was put up for a forced short sale to cover the mounting debts. Ross was ousted from his own holding company by a furious board of directors and faced immediate investigations by the state banking authority. Callum, stripped of his stolen funding, found his remaining shell companies targeted by aggressive civil suits for fraudulent conveyance. They had built a glittering castle on a foundation of stolen dirt, and I had simply pulled the dirt out from under them. In the chaotic aftermath, as the moving trucks arrived at the Gilbert estate and the reality of their bankruptcy set in, I did not offer a single cent of a bailout. I did not send a check to help my mother secure a new apartment. I did not soften. The money that was eventually clawed back from the frozen accounts and returned to the trust was not charity. It was restitution. I took that recovered capital, packed up my life in Denver, and channeled every ounce of my professional expertise into building my own empire. I founded Diaz Ledger Advisory, a boutique forensic auditing firm specializing in corporate embezzlement and trust mismanagement. I took the hypervigilance and the forensic survival skills my family had forced me to develop, and I turned them into a highly sought-after weapon for actual victims of financial fraud. I became the exact person I had needed when I was a teenager. The calendar turned over, exactly 1 year after sitting alone in the dark of my Denver apartment. The sun rose on the morning of my 31st birthday. I was standing in the bright, sunlit kitchen of my new home, pouring a cup of dark roast coffee. My life was no longer defined by the heavy, suffocating silence of waiting to be chosen. The air felt incredibly light. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, my phone began to ring. It was not a text arriving just minutes before midnight. It was not a panicked call from someone demanding a signature to save their own skin. It was Adrian, calling on his drive to work, followed closely by my lead investigator at the firm, and then a chorus of friends I had invited over for a dinner party that evening. I smiled, leaning against the marble counter, listening to the lively voices coming through the speaker. My family had spent a lifetime teaching me that I was easy to forget, but I had finally stopped waiting for them to remember. I had taken control of the ledger, burned their fraudulent empire to the ground, and built a brand new life where my name meant something, where my boundaries were ironclad, and where the people who loved me made absolutely sure to celebrate me long before the day was over. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment down below with your city or country, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Maya Revenge Stories, give this video a like, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.